Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to wait a few minutes for everybody to come in. Looks like everyone is almost in. A few more people dropping in. All right, well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance here at the Kennedy School, part of the Taubman Center for State and Local Government. This is our full Colloquia series. Our moderator is Professor Paul Peterson. Let me just say that we will have questions from the audience. If you could type in your questions in the Q&A portal of this webinar, we will call on you as we can. My name is Antonio Wendland. I'm the Associate Director of the program. Before I turn it over to Professor Peterson, our Program Director, let me announce next week's colloquia will feature Rocco Testani, who is an attorney that has done a lot of litigation in adequacy lawsuits. That's on October 1st, Thursday. On October 8th, Thursday, we have the pleasure of having Superintendent Alberto Carvalho, who's the superintendent of Miami-Dade County Public Schools. And he will talk to us about, can big city schools be held accountable? I can now turn this over to Professor Peterson, who will take us away.
Thank you, Antonio, and thank you for all of your work as the Associate Director to the program. So I'm very pleased today to have with me at our colloquium Michelle Rhee and George Parker. Michelle Rhee is the former Chancellor of the Washington, D.C. Public Schools and served in that capacity from 2007 to 2010. Under her leadership, the worst performing school district in the United States became the only major city system to see double-digit growth in reading and math in 7th, 8th, and 10th grades over 3 years. And during that period of time, she negotiated a transforming collective bargaining agreement with the teachers union that represented the teachers in the District of Columbia. And the person with whom she negotiated that contract is George Parker, who is today a senior advisor at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools and is a distinguished educator and expert on teaching and on school governance. He was a math teacher, an educator for 3 decades in the District of Columbia. And for 6 years, he served as president of the Washington Teachers Union. And during that tenure, as I've mentioned, he negotiated the groundbreaking collective bargaining agreement that we're going to be talking about today. So it's really a thrill for me to have on one panel the 2 people who negotiated perhaps the most interesting and hopefully the most path-breaking collective bargaining agreement ever reached in the United States. So thank you both for joining me on our colloquium today.
Absolutely, it's great to be here.
So let me ask you, first of all, how did you first get to know each other? We're going to get into, the negotiations and all that, but I'm sure our listeners would like to know more about you and about your relationship, how you first met, what it was like, how did things change when you got into negotiation, and what's happened since? Why are you willing to be on the same program at the same time?
Well, I guess I'll start, and then George, you can weigh in. So we had not met before I became chancellor, but I had heard about George. He had come into his job as president of the teachers union after a very tumultuous time in the union leadership. The prior president, I think, was indicted on embezzlement. And so it was a union that had gone through a lot of issues. And I think when George was elected president, the teachers were really looking for somebody very different. And, you know, from everything that I had heard, he was, I think of the words of Kaya Henderson, who at the time was working for me at the New Teacher Project, who oversaw our work in DC. She was like, he's a good guy. So that's kind of what I knew about him. And then very early on in my tenure, probably in the first few weeks, I invited George to come up to my office at DCPS, and I invited him to come up on I think it was on a Sunday. And what I didn't realize is that on the weekends, they didn't run the air conditioner. So it was super hot, and, you know, he ended up sweating the whole time. And afterwards, he was like, I thought you did that on purpose, just to see me sweat. But, you know, at that meeting, he came into it and said, look, you know, we've never met before this, but I you know, before you got here, but I've read a lot about you. And I know, you know, all the studies that the New Teacher Project put out. I know the kinds of things you're going to want in a collective bargaining agreement. But I just want to let you know that that's going to cost some money. You know, this is going to cost you big bucks. And he basically, you know, went on to tell me that that DCPS teachers were the lowest paid in the region. He said, even though they're the lowest paid in the region, I think they should be the most highly paid teachers in the region because they have the hardest jobs. And I looked at him and I said, I totally agree. So I think, kind of started on a shared premise that we had the same goal. We wanted DCPS teachers to be the highest paid in the region, if not the nation. And we didn't begin the negotiations right then and there. I think probably there was a few months before we started sitting down in earnest. But during that few month period, I think George and I tried to build a relationship, and I tried to just sort of establish that we really were on the same page, and that there were many things that we both sort of jointly wanted, and that certainly that there were things that he wanted for his teachers that I 100% agreed with and was willing to do outside of the contract negotiations.
So, Mr. Parker, would you like to add something to that?
Interesting. Once I took office, and I think 2007 is when Michelle came in, and pretty much, I think when we first met, it was probably on the steps of the council chambers. And so pretty much I looked at Michelle as, I'd been on negotiating teams in union contracts since probably the late 80s, right? And so I said, well, here comes a new one. We'll take care of her too. Because one of our repetitive things as unions is that we kind of wait people out, right? So it's like she's coming in with all of her new ideas and et cetera, and talking with her. She came off as a very nice person, but she had these ideas that she was going to make a lot of change. And I still had my consistent union framework. No, she's not going to make a lot of change. And but as times went on, and because I think we had developed a certain level of trust, I began to look at some of the changes that were needed, and some of those changes were needed. It was a hard fight. I mean, I think this contract took us about 3 years, didn't it?
Yeah.
I think 3 years. But I think that in the end, we ended up with a very good contract that was good for teachers, and it was also fair to teachers and good for kids. That's what we called it.
Yeah.
Well, let's start with that. Why do you say the contract was good for teachers and good for kids? So, Mr. Parker, why don't you begin, then we'll let Michelle expand on your observations.
I think teachers were empowered in the contract. First of all, financially, I thought it was just great to see our teachers go from been the last in the area in terms of compensation and benefits to going to number one. But it also, I think, improved in terms of teachers' professional development, teacher leadership. It wasn't all that we wanted. There were some things I probably would do differently if I had to go back, if I could go back and redo. But overall, I think that it ended up being very fair to teachers, but I thought we put a lot of educational stuff in there that was important for kids. Some of it controversial, but I think over the years, most of it has panned out to be positive and have a positive impact on the contract. But I think it was a very good contract for teachers in terms of teachers beginning to take a broader role in terms of leadership, period, within the buildings. And it did link accountability. I think the contract did something that from a union standpoint is difficult to do, and that is to insert more accountability into a contract, because that's just a difficult thing to do. And some teachers will perceive it as you're making our jobs harder. But I also think accountability is important. And so the piece of talking about accountability was something that I could buy into. I didn't buy into 100% of what we ended up doing with evaluation overall, but I can see the benefits of it a lot more now than I saw it all at that time.
All right, so Chancellor, how would you respond to that? How was this contract good both for teachers and for students?
Well, I think that George is right that it was good for teachers in lots of ways. I mean, the financial piece is the one that people talk about the most, right? So our teachers went from, again, being the lowest paid in the region to being the highest, but not just, the highest paid teachers in the region. We set up a system whereby you could, and this is back then, which was quite a while ago, you could, by your third year of teaching, if you were teaching in a high need subject area in a high need school and you were highly effective, you could be making six figures by your third year of teaching. So that was very significant, but there were other pieces to the contract that George mentioned in terms of much more robust professional development, resources for teachers, and teacher leadership opportunities that people don't talk about as much. I think that, so I do think it was good for fair for teachers, but I also think it's important to note that it was a contract that I felt was good for kids, because there were many union contracts that I had seen in the past that had provisions in it that I did not think were good for kids. So if you look at things like last in, first out, provisions that say that in a time of layoffs, if you're the newest teacher, then you're the first one laid off. Well, oftentimes, you have some great teachers who happen to be new. Why would you lay those folks off? You hear horror stories about big city school districts where in a particular school, a relatively new teacher who was teacher of the year then gets their pink slip first, that sort of thing. And nobody can argue that that is something that is good for students. Things like mutual consent that we negotiated, which meant that no teacher could be placed in a school unless both the teacher and the principal agreed to that, which means that you weren't just doing forced placements into schools. I think those were all things that we felt were extremely good for school environments, and in particular, things that were going to benefit kids in the long run. And I think that an evaluation system and a pay for performance system that allowed for us to retain the most highly effective teachers and remove those who were not effective overall was going to create a better dynamic for students. So we felt, my team and I felt very confident Again, we didn't get everything that we wanted either in the contract, just like George didn't get everything he wanted. But I think we felt very good that it was significantly better than the contract that had been in place, and that it sort of set up a precedent, hopefully, for prioritizing students and student achievement.
Well, Chancellor, let me follow up by asking you more about this fact that there was in this new relationship a situation where you could actually let teachers go because they had been identified as ineffective. They had been evaluated and they were identified as minimally effective or not effective at all, and they could be dismissed. Now, and without a long grievance procedure. So this is quite a change from practice in most big city school systems. So how did you, number one, get such a controversial piece into this agreement? And number two, how has that worked out?
So one of the things I think that people underestimate about the dynamics that we had in this negotiation was that they were very unusual. There were a number of pieces about the dynamic that were unusual, and I think that were helpful to me as the chancellor in negotiating the dynamic. But one of the things that is very different in DC than it is in other places is that several years before I came in, the city council had passed a provision that allowed the school district to determine the evaluation system. So the evaluation system itself, the tool itself, was not on the negotiating table. Now the pay and compensation that was tied to it was, but not the evaluation tool itself. So when we came into the district, we asked a lot of teachers how they felt about the performance evaluation system. We asked administrators, and it was pretty universally disliked. I don't think we could find a single person who liked the way that the evaluation system worked before, right? So people said, I might see my principal for 10 minutes. They look like they're checking off some boxes in a form. I get no real feedback, et cetera. So we really endeavored to put together an evaluation system that was radically different and that would be helpful to teachers in their professional development. So the basic kind of tenets and structure that we put in place was that 50% of the evaluation was based on student achievement gains, which at the time was unheard of, and something that took a lot of work on our side to get to the point where we felt was comfortable and fair. And the other 50% of the evaluation was based on a mix of observations of classroom practice, of the student achievement growth of the entire school, so that there was not just an individual, but also kind of a team dynamic happening, contributions to school community, and general professionalism. So, for example, with the observations of classroom practice, that changed significantly from what it was to we said that there had to be 5 observations a year, and of those observations, a number of them had to be done by a master teacher who was outside of the school, but who was an expert in the subject matter and grade level of that teacher. So those are the kinds of things that made teachers feel good. Obviously, the most controversial thing was the student achievement piece of the equation, which was 50% at the time. And what we wanted to do was make sure that we weren't evaluating teachers without, again, taking into consideration how much their kids were learning, but we wanted to do it in a fair way. So we spent a lot of time with teachers talking about how they felt about that, what their concerns were, and they brought up a lot of valid points. They'd say, for example, well, what do we do when a kid comes into our classroom in March You know, the test is at the end of April. We've had them for 1 month. Are they going to count against, you know, our data? You know, what about ELL or special education students? They, you know, have a lot of challenges in terms of their student achievement growth. And so we felt that we had created a system where we actually controlled in our regression analyses, we've controlled for special education status, for ELL, for attendance, and how many days they were you know, in the classroom, et cetera, and came up with, you know, certainly not by any means a perfect system, but one that I think took all of those considerations or all of those factors into consideration. And I think that once teachers understood that, they felt a lot more comfortable about it. But it was a lot of work, certainly. And it's at the time, it was pretty complicated and very, very different from anything that folks had seen before.
Yes, it was a truly new phenomenon out there. I agree with you on that. So, Mr. Parker, what's your assessment of this? I know that the union didn't have complete control over the terms of the evaluation system, but you must have had something to say. So how did you respond in the negotiations to this pretty dramatic change in the way teachers were being assessed?
You know, we lost the right to negotiate the teacher evaluation process in, I think, in '99. And so I felt Michelle had a great advantage in developing the teacher evaluation process. Of course, we did have some input, but overall, that was her final decision making and had the right to do it. I originally thought 50% was a little too high for a first-time evaluation piece.
50% being on the testing, student performance on tests.
Yeah, I had challenges with that. I thought that was a little high at that time. I'm not sure what it is now. I think it may be a little less. I'm not sure. But overall,
I think I read somewhere it's more like 30%.
I think it's about 30 now.
Yeah.
Overall, I desired for us to have a pilot period before it was implemented. But of course, Michelle was ready to go. And so she went with it, and we couldn't do anything about it. But I think teachers have adapted to it quite well. I think there were rewards on the other end. I do think that they have worked on it to some degree. I don't know exactly where it is now. I don't know if there's an effort by the union at this point to get rid of it or whether they will try to make some changes to it. But it has pretty much stood the test of time. It's been about 10 years now.
Yes, it's the last I heard, it was still in place. Now, the question is, did it help that teachers had a choice to go under the new contract or the new merit pay kind of arrangement, or stick to the traditional schedule where you go year by your experience? Did you negotiate that the teachers would have a choice in this respect?
I think you're talking about the red and green tier. Oh my God, that was a nightmare for negotiations. Actually, we had this idea of, look, my thoughts were when Michelle presented it is that, look, let's present it, just have some discussions with teachers in terms of how they feel about this. And once we set up the discussions, the persons who are already opposed to the contract negotiations as they were, they had a field day on that because it got into press and et cetera. And all of a sudden teachers were believing that we had already negotiated and settled on this double tier of paying. Yeah. But that was not in the agreement because we originally did this in an effort to see how teachers felt about this, but it went way beyond that in terms of folks believing, hey, you've already agreed to this pay system of red and green. But yeah, that was, it was on the table.
So I it's important for people who are listening who don't have the context to this. What George had said to me early on, which made a whole lot of sense, is look, if we want to put a new compensation system in place with basically new rules, but you've got a whole lot of people who have been in the system who came into the system and they signed up under a different set of rules. So how can you change, move the goal line, right? So the way that we set it up was basically to say, for existing teachers in the system, they had a choice between red and green, and brand new teachers to the system would all just go into the new system, the green. So the notion was, if you were on green, which was the new system, again, you sort of had massive possibilities in terms of increased pay. I talked a little bit earlier about what those looked like. If you chose, but the big thing was that if you chose green, you gave up your tenure. And you could also, if you were an existing teacher, choose not to go on to that system, which is to say on the red track, in which case you did not have the same access to those large pay bumps, et cetera. But you were able to sort of maintain your tenure kind of in, I guess, the way that people sort of had it in their minds. So that was like the original sort of viewpoint on that. And ultimately the entire system did change over to, so there's not the system anymore, but we did actually start out that way with this choice. And I do think it was an important one to have, because there were lots of people who were actually very, very good teachers, but who were scared, right? I mean, this is a brand new evaluation system. You had lots of people who were saying to them, look, this is the administration's way of just moving out veteran teachers because we're the most expensive, like we have the highest salaries. So they're trying to get you to give up your tenure so that they could move us out and replace us with brand new, cheaper teachers. There was a lot of talk about things like that, and I think people were nervous. But I also think that in those first couple of years, when some people were afraid that was going to happen and chose to stay on red, didn't go on green, and then you had other teachers who decided, okay, I'm going to go on green, and they saw wow, this person is getting paid a whole lot more money. They're still here, right? And now they've got a new car and they paid for their daughter's wedding and lots of good things. And, wait a second, what am I doing? So, eventually that all did change, but that was sort of the initial premise behind it, was kind of easing people into it and ensuring that they felt like they had a choice in the matter as it pertained to teachers who were already in the district.
Now I'm going to try to share my screen here and see if I can do this because I wanted to show, we'll go back in a minute here. So yeah, I'll just leave it like this because you can see, I think, pretty well. So this is what the test scores on the National Assessment of Educational Progress look like, the District of Columbia. And that yellow bar takes us all the way back to 1998. The green bar takes us to 2000, which is before all of this takes place. And then 2013 and 2015 is, 6-8 years later after this new agreement's been in place. And if you look at this, you'll see that the District of Columbia on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, this is not the district's own test. This is a national test that's administered to school districts across the country, that the District of Columbia really shifted upward, both at the 4th grade level in math and reading and at the 8th grade level. So all those bars are longer if they're blue and pink than if they are yellow and green. And that's the biggest change that's happened in any big city school system across the country. That's genuine improvement out there. So, Mr. Parker, I'm going to ask you, why do you think that's happened? Did this agreement, is that part of the story, or is there something else going on there? How do you assess that?
I think the agreement is a part of the story. I think the agreement had a lot of educational forward thinking in it to the benefit of children. So I definitely think that it has had a positive effect on student outcomes. Not a perfect agreement, of course, by any means, but I think it has had a positive impact. The city is changing, and I've heard, some folks say, well, you're getting different dynamics in the city because of gentrification. And that could be true. I'm not sure what impact it plays, but I think the new contract and the contract negotiated played a major role in student achievement improving in the district, for sure.
Yeah, it went up for students from all ethnic backgrounds. It's not like it's concentrated on any particular group of students. It's sort of across the board. The other thing, though, is there's a lot of charter schools in the district. And I know you're today head of the, or advisor to the National Charter. So some people might say, no, the agreement didn't have much to do with it. It was the competition posed by the charter schools. So how do you react to that?
I don't have data. I'm not going to say that competition doesn't have an impact. So competition could have been a part of it. I still think the internal things that were in the contract had a significant role in terms of opening the door for a higher level of student achievement. I don't think that excludes the possibility that these other factors played a role, but I think that the contract played a major role because the contract affected how teachers worked within the schools and the quality of teachers and et cetera. And I think that played a major role in how the district moved forward in improving student achievement, but not the exclusion of saying that these other factors didn't play some role. But I think by far opening the door for teachers to have more freedom, better professional development, better pay, and attracting teachers, I think the contract had a big part in improving that.
I think it's important to note that, lots of people are looking for the silver bullet solution. And so, people who like the contract and, like the evaluation system say, oh, look at DC, they put this in place and they saw these gains. And I agree with George that was this a part of it? Absolutely. But was it the only thing that was driving things? Absolutely not. We had a huge effort towards improving the actual school facilities that kids were going to every day, to the technology, to the food they were eating. I think that you cannot underestimate the work that Kaya and her team did on the curriculum and professional development for teachers. That curricular work was incredible in terms of being able to provide teachers with the supports that they needed to be able to work within the new Common Core standards. So that was there. I think in terms of the question about competition, I definitely think that had the district not been in a place where, I think when I came in, it was 40% of the students in the district were enrolled in charter schools, somewhere around there.
I think that's close to being the right number. Yeah.
And it was because of that number and that dynamic and that pressure that I think it made the folks in government in DC say, okay, wait a second. If we don't do something pretty dramatic with the DC public school system, then 10 years from now, we might not even have a traditional public school system. It might all be charter schools. And so I think there was, that was a lot of the impetus, I think, for why people voted for one, Mayor Fenty to come in, because he was sort of running on this education platform. But then it's also a lot of the pressure that allowed the city council to vote for mayoral control. And I don't think that any of those things would have come about were it not for the pressure from the charter sector. And so I think that was an important piece also. I do want to say, though, that something interesting occurred in that whole dynamic when we passed this contract, which was the following. So for years before this contract was in place, what typically happened was that people would go to DCPS, they would teach for a year or two, just when, as principals would say, they were getting good, then they would be snatched up by the charter schools, would recruit them away, or sometimes the suburban school districts, Montgomery County, Arlington, et cetera, would then take these folks after DCPS had actually trained them. And, back when that used to happen, the charter schools would say, oh, well, competition is good. It's good for everybody, keeps you on your toes, that sort of thing. So when we passed this contract and essentially made DCPS teachers the highest paid teachers in the country, I started getting some calls from people in the charter sector who were very worried, right? People who sat on charter boards of charter schools, et cetera, and said, okay, Michelle, this is going to be a real problem for us. You guys are going to be paying teachers, effective teachers, so much money that that our best teachers are potentially going to flock to DCPS. So this is an issue. This is a problem. We really need to figure out, like, can we get on an aligned pay scale with the charters and DC? And I said, wait a second. When you were paying more and managing to get great teachers to come to you, then competition was a good thing. And then when we have the competitive advantage, now competition isn't good anymore. Now you want to align, so it sort of shifted the dynamic a little bit. And I think, really shone a light on charter schools to say, look, if you think that competition is good, then you can't only think that when you have the competitive advantage. You also have to think that competition is good when the school district itself is doing well and is reforming and is improving. Then you also have to think that's a positive thing. And I think of different charter leaders felt different ways, but certainly I think many of them did see that for themselves and for their organizations as, okay, we can't be complacent. Like, the district is really upping its game and improving everything, again, from facilities to the professional development they provide to teachers and compensation. So we really, if we're going to be competitive, we really have to make sure that we're doing our best as well. So I think it ended up being good, across sectors.
Well, great. Yeah.
As I think back,
yeah.
as I think back about that and hearing Michelle talk, charter schools did put a little pressure on me as a union leader, because I didn't want to lose teachers, because at that point, charter schools in the district were not organized, unionized. And so there was pressure that parents were beginning to send their kids to charters, and we had quite a few of them. And I was concerned, you're right, I was concerned about the number of teachers I would be losing and students we'd be losing to charters. So that was an incentive to make this contract a lot more open and reform-minded. Yeah.
Well, so Mr. Parker, let me push on that, because where does all this money come from? It's great for you to say, okay, we raise teachers' salaries and they now are making more money than anybody else in the metropolitan area, charters or suburban schools. But where's the money coming from, and why wasn't it there before? So let me ask you that question first, Mr. Parker, and then we'll get the Chancellor's comments.
I think Michelle can talk a little bit more about the relationship with the mayor. But I think when Michelle came, the mayoral control was for the first year of the school district. I think that the mayor was committed. And then Michelle had resources beyond just the district that I thought was very helpful, especially in terms of the performance pay piece. But I thought there was a commitment by the mayor and by the council to fund the contract. And I think that was important because everyone realized that we needed to turn education around in the district, without a doubt. And I think that the council and the mayor and others responsible for the funding made it a priority. And I think Michelle was good in advocating for the kind of money that was needed to turn this district around. So that's good.
So, Chancellor, how do you elaborate on that thought? Yeah.
So I agree with George that the mayor, Mayor Fenty 100% made schools his #1 priority. In fact, I think so much so that it drove people in other sectors nuts. He would show up to a developers conference and have to, give the welcome address, and he'd just spend the whole time talking about schools. And so his entire tenure, it was clear to everybody in the city that this was his top priority. I think we did a few things. When I started working in DCPS, it was a district that spent almost more money per pupil than any other urban school district in the country. And so, a lot of what people were lamenting is, there doesn't seem to be a lack of resources in this district, but why isn't it resulting in higher student achievement levels and in better school environments, et cetera? And I think a lot went into that. But so one of the things that we tried to do was, of the $1 billion budget that existed for education in the district, only about 403 million of that actually went down to the schools. That means the majority of the money was being spent at sort of, central office and, that sort of thing. So we worked really hard to flip that dynamic and ensure that the majority of the money was going down to schools. So that was one very difficult but important piece. But the main lever, to be honest, was that, when we were at the tail end of these negotiations and implementing this contract, it was in 2009 during the height of the financial crisis in this country, where every single school district in the nation and state was having to cut budgets, and we were not spared from that. So we had to lay teachers off, et cetera. And the way that we were able to put this contract in place was we raised external dollars. So we had a plan where we would have external foundation dollars come in to fund the contract and the pay raises for the first 5 years. And what we committed to in exchange for that was that we would have a plan for how we were going to change the way that the district spent money over that 5-year period, so that it wasn't necessary to have that external money ongoing, that we would be able to bear those costs within the district within 5 years. And I actually think we accomplished that before the 5 years were up, which was, I think, a pretty good accomplishment. But for certain, this would not have been possible were it not for the philanthropic support that we got from Eli Broad Foundation, John and Laura Arnold, the Walton Foundation. Those were some of the ones that came in. I think that what was unusual is that a number of those foundations hadn't ever really invested in traditional public school district reform. They thought it was important enough, but they weren't, at the table, kind of in the weeds on the specifics of it. They really had to sort of trust the process and what George and I came up with. Obviously, at the end of the day, before they said that they were going to give the money, they were able to see what the contract looked like and able to ensure that they felt like it was going to move the needle significantly. But that was for sure a big part of the equation.
So, you know, you mentioned the mayor and his critical support. Both of you mentioned that. But then, of course, the mayor loses the election. You actually resign your position before the election, hoping that maybe that would get him off the hook. But the voters turned down, and education was the issue in some respect. And so one question is, why didn't the voters support this change? And the second question is, but still, you know, the plan is still in place. So can you just talk about this, this fact, which it's very hard to tie those facts all together and make it into a story. So can you explain that?
Yeah. I think there were a few things going on. So first of all, I said this earlier, and I don't think I can say this enough, that none of what we accomplished in DCPS during this time period would have been possible were it not for the mayor. He was so unbelievably focused on wanting to improve the schools. He really gave me like unequivocal support. There were lots of things that we did that caused him significant political problems. And at no time in the 4 years that we spent together, 3.5 years that we spent together, did he ever say, oh, you know what, Michelle, I'm not sure, it's going to upset some people. You know, his question was always, is this going to be good for kids? Is this going to make our schools better? Then do it. And we don't have enough politicians like that in this country, in my mind. And so Adrian Fenty cannot be, and his importance in this cannot be understated at all. I think the dynamic that you're talking about is certainly one that was frustrating, at least to me personally, right? So, you know, the Washington Post did a poll right before the primary election that they had done every year, asking residents, you know, how are you feeling about different things in the city? And one topics was about the schools. So how are you feeling about the schools? And it showed that record numbers of people were feeling positively about the direction of DCPS and the strides that we had made. So that, you know, was at an all-time high. And yet people didn't like me, didn't like the mayor, right? And so I think that, you know, folks at the time felt, okay, we like that things are getting better, things are improving. They could see, I mean, they could see the school buildings getting renovated. They could see that when they called the school district, somebody was answering the phone, they were getting their questions answered, et cetera. But they didn't like the how of how it was getting done, because it was messy, it was ugly. I mean, you know, George led plenty of protests against us, you know, different protests in front of City Hall, and it was causing a lot of consternation in the community. One woman that I talked to towards the end was like, you know, this is what people were fighting about at the Thanksgiving dinner table, right? Was red and green, is it right or not? And she said it was the first time in the history of DC where, like, for a pretty long period of time, every time my family came together, we were talking about schools, because that was the main, you know, topic in the city. Again, I think because the mayor made it so. But you know, we made I think, even though we did a lot of good things in terms of the policies that we were putting in place, one of the things that we did really poorly was building the kind of community support and understanding of what we were doing and why. You know, I very naively felt like, oh, you know, if we're going to lay teachers off by quality instead of seniority, that's obvious, you know, why we're doing it. And I didn't necessarily feel the need to go out and talk about it in the press, but George saw that as an opportunity to say like, oh, this is what she's trying to do. You know, she's trying to get rid of the senior teacher. So, you know, I think George and the unions were much more savvy about and much more knowledgeable about like messaging and taking advantage of sort of pushing the narrative. And I think we did a very bad job of that. And because we did not do as good a job, I think that we didn't have as much community support for the specific kind of actions that we were putting in place, even though, again, sort of the overall impact that it was having, people liked.
So good. I'm going to let some people listening in have a chance to pose some questions. But before doing that, Mr. Parker, do you want to just comment on this topic of the mayor and politics?
You know, I have one of the most memorable experiences I had with the mayor when Michelle and I got to the negotiating table. I can't remember, Michelle, what it was that you had put on the table, but I told you we need to go talk with the mayor because we're not going down this road. And so I think I called the mayor. We set up a meeting with Michelle and the mayor and I, because I began to approach these negotiations similarly to how I approached the previous negotiations. So, you know, we supported the mayor and et cetera. So I figured I'd go ahead and talk to the mayor and, you know, they look, we're used to this kind of stuff, seniority and other kind of stuff we don't need to talk about. So I walked in and I explained what the problem was, and the mayor looked and it's like, this is my person. I've given her total control. If this is what she wants to do, then I'm supporting her. That was a major change. That was a major memorable moment for me, because at that point, we didn't have a school board anymore where I had politicians that we had supported I could go to and say, look, Michelle Rhee is talking crazy about seniority and other things. I just need you to kind of quieten this down. It was the mayor had all the power, and the mayor said, I'm with Michelle on this, and we're going to create change. So it put a different mindset on negotiations, period. Because for the first time, I think I had to focus more on real issues in education, as opposed to saying, no, we're not going to discuss this, and discuss whether it is really good for kids, whether it's good for teachers or whatever. So I think that was the beginning of me looking at negotiations totally different, because we had to find a way to get to an agreement. But I think I had more educational effort in this particular agreement than previous contracts I've been on, where politics played more of a role. This was really more of an educationally oriented contract.
All right, so let's open this up to our listeners. Antonio, do you want to call on people?
Sure. We have a question here from Wendy Levinson. Wendy, are you still with us? Let's see.
Yes.
Could you ask your question to the...
I just was wondering if you can point to how did instruction change? I know there was a tremendous overhaul, but what were the key elements of how instruction changed?
Yeah, so I'll talk about this a little bit. When I first came to the district, I did teacher listening sessions, where I would go to a school and any teacher could come and we could, you know, just basically talk about anything that was on their mind. And I remember early on going to one of these sessions, and a woman came up to me and she's like, look, I know that there's a lot of controversy around you and these different things you're trying to do. She's like, I just want you to know, I am a good soldier. I'm gonna do what the district wants me to do. She said, but it is not clear what you want me to do. She said, there's these standards over here, then there's the curriculum and the scope and sequence, and then we have our textbooks over here. And she's like, none of these things are aligned, and it's not clear, like, what is most important to you? What do you want to see when you walk into a classroom? And I think it was absolutely true. There were lots of different resources, but it wasn't clear like how they all came together and what was prioritized. And so one of the things that we did was we worked really hard on what we called the teaching and learning framework, where we outlined, very specifically what we wanted to see when we walked into classrooms, on a variety of different measures of how teachers should be looking at the curricular resources that they had, how they should utilize the textbook versus the scope and sequence documents. And I think kind of pulling that all together in the teaching and learning framework and being able to then hand that over to teachers so that they were really clear on, what we thought good teaching and learning, looked like, and how we were going to assess that and measure that, and what the professional development was going to be around that. I think that went a really long way in sort of changing what was happening in classrooms, because that clarity and the prioritization and the alignment had happened. I don't know, George, if you have other thoughts on that.
I thought clarity was important. I think that teachers across every school clearly understood how their effectiveness was going to be measured. Whether it was something that we completely agree with or not, teachers were very clear on how their effectiveness would be measured, which I think helped to generate the kind of instruction that was focused toward what the expected outcomes were. I think prior to that, even though it was a school system, individual schools took evaluations seriously, depending upon whether or not your principal took them seriously or not. I think clarity was very important in that. I think resources. The one thing I give Michelle credit for is that she did bring our schools up in terms of technology. You remember, Michelle, when you first came, and I told you that one of the things that frustrated me so much was that here we were in 2007 and our teachers didn't have a computer for teacher administrative services in the classroom to keep attendance and et cetera. And I remember you told me, you said, we'll have it by October, and it was done. But I think bringing in more resources, I think helping teachers, having the professional evaluators who were in the field to come in and evaluate teachers and provide assistance. I think that also helped to improve instruction overall.
Okay, additional questions, Antonio?
We have a question coming in from Joseph Olszewski. Joseph?
Thank you, Antonio. Michelle, it's great. Hi, it's great to see you. As you know, Michelle, I was superintendent of Seattle Public Schools from 1998 to 2003. And I think all of us in the superintendent community watched you and your leadership at DC Public Schools. And we're really proud of you. The question I have for you is, my sense is we went through a period nationally that there was the political will, and you talked about Adrian Fenty, and I certainly had a fair amount of political will in Seattle, but a number of districts around the country created expectations that superintendents would lead these aggressive, kind of change agendas as you did. I feel now that period is over, and districts are increasingly asking their superintendents to sort of play nice and go along and get along and not take on the type of aggressive changes that you took on. My question is, what would you advise? I mean, number one, do you agree with that general observation? But then number two, what would you advise a superintendent today who had some of the same aspirations that you did around change for kids and improving the system and in the process, dramatically changing, I would argue, transforming the school system? What would you advise a superintendent today when, I think the appetite for this sort of aggressive change is sort of in our rearview mirror?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe lots of people would blame what Adrian and I did in DC for the loss of appetite, because we were really aggressive, and then he lost his reelection bid. And so for many politicians, I think they looked at it and were like, okay, well, we liked a lot of what happened, but we didn't like the not getting reelected part. So can you maybe do some of this, but do it a little nicer or softer, or something that's not going to get me thrown out. And obviously, I think that's unfortunate, because I think, as I said earlier, one of the strengths of Adrian was that his end game was not reelection. His end game was making the schools better, and that's what gave us the landscape that allowed us to put these changes in place. I think it's a lot harder when you don't have a leader with that political capital, because superintendents don't have political capital, really. It's your mayors, your governors, your city council members, et cetera. So if you don't have that, is it hopeless for a superintendent? I don't think so. I just think it's a lot harder. And I think one of the untapped potentials of how to really create some pressure is with parents, right? Is organizing parents, but that's a tricky thing, because the school district itself can't organize parents around these issues. That has to, I think, be done by external nonprofits and other organizations that really could do that. And it's not quick or easy work, as you probably know, right? I mean, organizing parents it's time consuming. You have to build trust. You have to build the relationships. This is like longer horizon work, but I absolutely think it is possible. We've seen some of it happen in places like Memphis and Charleston, South Carolina, with different programs. And so I do feel like there's a lot of potential there. And then I just think that today's political climate nationally is so different. And, I think that people feel like the fight right now is on a different, is on a different set of issues. And so less attention is being paid to this, because folks just feel like there are sort of fundamental societal issues that have to be addressed first and that take precedent.
Yeah. So, Mr. Parker, you want to comment?
Yeah, I'm not sure I will agree 100% that the time period has passed. I think that the conditions that are associated with the COVID-19 dilemma for schools offer opportunities for superintendents to really be extraordinary leaders, to be very creative. I think probably public awareness of what public education is now is a lot broader than it was last year this time, just with parents having to experience keeping kids at home and entertaining the idea of educating them and being engaged in terms of online instruction. I think the climate of where do we go from here in terms of education? I think clearly after COVID, things will never be totally the same. But I think education at this point, if we're gonna make major changes in education, I think the climate now is here, because I think parents are looking for educational leadership in the sense of, so what are we gonna do now? And what are we going to do to prepare? I think the door is wide open now for really some creative and imaginative leadership on the part of superintendents.
I just want to add into that, because I agree, George, with that assessment. And I think if there's one good thing that happens from COVID, hopefully, it will be a different appreciation for teachers. I have friends who work in nonprofits and thought they were really sensitive to the pressures of being a teacher, et cetera. And they're like, I can't do this for 30 minutes without my kids driving me insane. I have no idea how teachers do this all day, every day. And I think for parents over the last 6 months, seeing this firsthand, I do hopefully think that it will impact us as a society to understand that teaching is literally you know, if not the most difficult job that there is, one of them. And hopefully with that comes a greater appreciation for the teaching profession.
All right, well, we're running out of time, but we'll take one more question.
Perfect. So Ira Stoll?
Yeah, thanks. I'm always reading about Congress trying to impose school vouchers or opportunity scholarships on DC. And I wonder if you could talk about what role, if any, that played in helping to push the reforms that you have been talking about.
So I'll talk about it from my perspective, and George may have another one because he was there longer than me. But I'd say that the opportunity scholarships and the federal vouchers played a similar role to charters in terms of kind of creating that dynamic where the district, we couldn't be complacent, right? Because we had charters and we had the voucher program. So if families were unsatisfied with what we were doing, and a lot of them were, there were options for them to take advantage of. And we really, you know, the mayor, when I first came in, was like, we think that a healthy tri-sector approach is gonna, you know, result in positive outcomes for kids. Now, and George has different thoughts, obviously, on vouchers. I believe in choice, but I don't believe in choice for choice sake, right? I'm not one of these people who's like, you know, let 1,000 flowers bloom, let everybody run a school, and everybody will know which schools are good. No, I don't subscribe to that. I believe in choice if it results in better opportunities and outcomes for kids. And so while I think that vouchers can be helpful, and I am in favor of that concept in a general sense, I think that it has to be managed well. I think that there has to be accountability for those private schools, just as there are for the charter schools and the traditional public schools. And I don't think that, you know, just a random voucher system that doesn't have that accountability, I don't think is going to necessarily produce better outcomes for kids. So I'm sorry, to answer your question though, I do think it was that the voucher program was helpful in creating a dynamic in DC that ensured that parents could, you know, essentially vote with their feet and had options for their kids to get a better education if they felt like DCPS wasn't providing that.
All right, so Mr. Parker, we're going to give you the last word here.
On vouchers? Okay. Well, I mean, I have a slight support for vouchers if they have means tests, in terms of, I think for those kids who need the opportunity to attend another school and the vouchers only with it, they can do it. If it's in the mean tested, I think it can happen, it can work. Vouchers were not a significant factor in my being willing to be more open to change. Vouchers were not as much of a factor as charters were. Charters were much bigger threat to me as a union president in terms of taking away students and et cetera. So vouchers weren't that important to me at that point.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. George Parker, who negotiated a contract with the District of Columbia Public Schools under the leadership of Chancellor Michelle Rhee. Thank you both for joining me in this really fascinating conversation. We hope that our audience will join us again next week at the same time, when we will have Rocco Testani speaking on adequacy lawsuits. And so I would like also to just sort of thank Mr. Parker and Chancellor Rhee for being available for our class at 1:30 today. So we look forward to continuing this conversation in a smaller group, and hope that all of you will join us for another conversation a week from today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.